Another point worth making about Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy is that the only philosopher living at the time when that book was written and published who had a chapter devoted to him in it was John Dewey. Well, let's now move to Dewey. We've talked about Peirce and James and their attempts to improve the methods by which human beings can acquire new knowledge and increase their understanding of their environment, both in an ordinary life context and in an organized way through science. And we've talked about how this involved them in, among many other things, clarifying exactly what it is we mean by the concept of meaning, clarifying exactly what we mean by the concept of truth, and finding what the proper functioning of these concepts is within an overall conception of inquiry, whether in ordinary life or scientific inquiry. Now, that's the position up to which we've taken the discussion now. Now, Dewey, the real starting point for Dewey was enormous impressedness with the success of science. He saw that this science that we've been talking about over the last 300 or 400 years has supplied mankind with far and away its most reliable knowledge, far and away its quantitatively biggest amount of reliable knowledge. It's a huge success story, almost unprecedented in the cognitive history of mankind. Well, in fact, unprecedented. Now, thought Dewey, what is it about science that gives it this fantastic success? And is it something that we can apply to other areas of life, notably the social sciences, political life, social problems, and so on, with the same rich success? That was really his starting point, wasn't it? Can you take it up from there?
He gave some reasons, if you wish, for the success of science, at least in the sense that science couldn't have been successful unless there was some possibility of continuation and of certain science being institutionalized, its habits being institutionalized, and men and women engaged in cooperative research. So,
yes, but what really struck Dewey about the successfulness of science wasn't due to its institutionalization, was it? It was due to its method.
Yeah, but the method is institutionalized.
You think the institutionalization is
well,
part
in
of
a
the
way,
method?
okay.
Yes.
I mean,
yes.
no, part of the notion, no, I should be clear. Part of the method is the method of drawing inference, but also the method of cooperative research and how one engages in kinds of decisions about cooperative research. So he gave some particular explanation of social support and some particular explanation in terms of this method. Scientists could engage in cooperative research were it not this agreement on how one can adjudicate conflicting alternatives. The scientific community would not remain stable. Now, obviously, the Dewey picture or some picture like that is at best the first approximation, and one has to work out all sorts of arguments as to whether or not this always can hold or whether it holds only in certain cases, and there's discussion about that. But now one can push, okay, granted, but how do we know it will continue in the future? Maybe tomorrow, suddenly, all the attempts to accept a theory on the basis of evidence, etc., will lead to failure. How do we know the world isn't chaotic and ultimately, or won't change? And now, it's these kinds of questions that get puzzling, and possibly one might think of this deeply enough as sort of a request, if one wants to talk this way, as a sort of justification of induction, relying on certain kinds of observable outcomes to project. And for this, Dewey doesn't really want to engage in this kind of a question. He avoids that kind of a question. But granted that in some sense we accept induction, in some sense of induction, because as you know how difficult it is to formulate that phrase without begging lots of issues about science. If we do, then we can rely on the past history of science to indicate we're rationally entitled to rely on its method. It has over time proven better than its competitors, as you've pointed out. But that's internal justification. Now, whether or not this actually is the truth, once again, as some people think that this is sort of rigged. They've been better than competitors because the competitors haven't given a fair chance of competing. But anyway, this is sort of talking about the justification of our acceptance of science, the pragmatic justification on continuation of reliance in science, But now, as you point out, this is one question about the justification of science. The other issue is justification from within. What kind of procedures one could use to come to some particular desirable or reasonable, or what he would say warranted outcome of inquiry. This interconnection with formal rules, contextual factors.
In his formulation of a view of scientific method, he rejected what he saw as being the most common of all the predecessor theories, and on at least one occasion he designated that as the spectator view of knowledge. He said that Western man had made one fundamental error for hundreds of years in his philosophy by thinking of man as a spectator on the world. The world is something that we look at, that we observe, and through our observations we acquire knowledge of it. That whole model, said Dewey, is entirely misleading because we are not spectators, we're agents. We are biological organisms living in an environment in which we've got to survive. Knowledge is just about the most important and useful single tool for survival that we have in this situation, because it confers understanding of our environment, and that confers a certain degree of mastery of the environment. So we're not spectators at all. We're in amongst it, having to act all the time on the basis of beliefs right or wrong, or imperfect or inadequate as they may be. And it's in that situation that we're trying to acquire understanding and knowledge and proceeding with our inquiries. So his whole view of scientific method and of the acquisition of knowledge and the growth of knowledge was seen from the standpoint not of a spectator, an observing subject, as previous philosophers had so frequently said, but from the standpoint of an agent, wasn't it?
Well, a great number of themes in Dewey are captured by your analysis, but a lot of these themes are not merely theses about knowledge. It's also theses of how one understands a particular, as I say, a human being naturalistically. It's to avoid certain kind of dualisms, that one could sort of think there's a mind and a body, and one looks for their interconnections. And it turns out actually to be very, very naturalistic. Humans are organisms. One learns about human organisms in terms of how they act and interact with the world. And he's always given this action and transaction. That's part of Dewey's general philosophical anthropology, if one wants to look in terms of part of his quasi-behavioral analysis of mental concepts, and also part of the notion is one has to look for institutional factors, or the culture in which one lives, to explain certain kinds of judgments and to explain why certain kinds of perceptual judgments are made. Also, in relationship to the theory of knowledge, he wants to get away from another kind of picture that's frequently been associated with the pragmatist, namely that men are primarily acting and reacting on the world and trying to improve it. And he wants to say no, and he gives lots of theories, lots of theses, to show how knowledge is sort of comes under special circumstances, where the demand of inquiry comes about. It's not that we're always inquiring. To use a loose phrase, we're in the world in all sorts of ways, and Dewey tries to specify it. When it comes to actual knowledge, Dewey isn't interested in a general analysis of knowledge. He says the word knowledge is used in all sorts of ways. But what he's interested in is the specific sense of knowledge, what he thinks is the reasonable one, namely how one acquires warranted beliefs as a result of inquiry. And he thought that's the aim of knowledge, to get warranted beliefs and to get warranted beliefs as a result of inquiry, especially when there's a need for revision of beliefs. Now, secondly, he wants to get away from this view which we call the spectator theory of knowledge, in another sense of the spectator theory of knowledge, namely that belief has certain kinds of objects, knowledge has other kinds of objects, and that if we can get certainty, we can sort of have certainty about these specific objects which are sort of transitory, and if we're going to get knowledge which is certain, we have to get it knowledge by being sort of suitably cognitively related to a certain kind of entity. So he thinks this is sort of an approach that lots of people had, which he's debating against. He's also debating against the view that somehow one can jump out of our particular conceptual scheme, and to judge our conceptual scheme is to see whether it sort of matches an independent reality.